Hey there, history buffs. So you think you know who the richest people in the world are? Musk, Bezos, Zuckerberg, the usual suspects from the Forbes list, right? Well, here's a fun thought. What if the real financial titans never bothered showing up on those lists at all? What if they built the entire game everyone else is still trying to win? Today we're talking about the Rothschilds, a family that went from a cramped ghetto in Frankfurt to literally financing both sides of the Napoleonic Wars and thinking, yeah, that's just Tuesday. This isn't your typical rags to riches fairy tale. This is the story of how five brothers spread across 5 countries created what was basically the world's first multinational corporation. Except instead of selling coffee or smartphones, they were selling money itself. To kings, to emperors, to entire nations. And somehow, after 200 years, revolutions, world wars, and that one time the Nazis specifically made a propaganda film about them, they're still here. Still wealthy, still powerful, and still absolutely nowhere on any rich list you've ever seen. So before we dive into this rabbit hole of gold, secrets, and carrier pigeons faster than government mail, do me a favor. Smash that like button if you're into stories about people who played chess while everyone else was playing checkers. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know which corners of the world are tuning in for this one. Ready? Let's get into it. Now, to understand how the Rothschilds became the Rothschilds, we need to rewind the clock and take a little trip to 18th century Frankfurt. And I'm going to be honest with you. This isn't exactly the kind of destination you'd find on a travel influencer's bucket list. We're talking about a place called the Judengasse, which translates to Jews' Lane. And if you're picturing some quaint cobblestone street with charming cafes and artisan bakeries, I'm going to need you to adjust your expectations dramatically. The Judengasse was a narrow, cramped alley, roughly 300 meters long and maybe 4 meters wide in some places, crammed with about 3,000 people living in conditions that would make modern health inspectors weep into their clipboards. This wasn't a neighborhood. It was essentially a human storage facility with prayer services. The Jewish communities of medieval and early modern Europe existed under what can only be described as a masterclass in institutional oppression. The restrictions placed upon them weren't subtle suggestions. They were iron laws enforced with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for collecting parking fines. Jews were forbidden from owning land, which in an agricultural society was basically like telling someone today they couldn't have a bank account, a credit card, or any form of savings. They were banned from joining guilds, which meant the vast majority of skilled trades were completely off the table. Want to be a blacksmith? Sorry, Christians only. Dreaming of becoming a baker? Not unless you convert. Interested in carpentry, masonry, or literally any profession that might allow you to build generational wealth through physical labor? The answer was a resounding no, delivered with varying degrees of hostility depending on the century and the mood of whoever was in charge that week. And it gets better, or worse depending on your perspective. Jews in Frankfurt were required to live exclusively within the Judengasse, which was locked at night and on Sundays and Christian holidays. That's right, the entire neighborhood had a curfew enforced by actual gates. Imagine telling 3,000 people they can't leave their street after dark because, well, reasons. The housing situation was predictably catastrophic. With no ability to expand outward due to legal restrictions, the only option was to build upward, resulting in buildings that were several stories tall, leaning precariously over the narrow lane, blocking out sunlight and creating a perpetual twilight even at noon. Fire was a constant threat, and indeed, the ghetto burned down multiple times throughout its history, because when you pack thousands of people into wooden structures with open flames for cooking and heating, physics and chemistry eventually have opinions about your urban planning choices. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where we start to see the peculiar genius that adversity can produce. When you systematically exclude a population from 90% of economic activities, they don't just sit around feeling sorry for themselves, or at least the ones who survive don't. They specialize, they adapt, they become extraordinarily good at the few things they're actually allowed to do. And for European Jews, those things were primarily money lending, trade, and dealing in second-hand goods. Now, money lending had its own complicated history. Christian doctrine at the time considered charging interest on loans, what they called usury, to be a sin. This created an awkward situation where medieval economies desperately needed credit to function, but the people who ran those economies had religious objections to providing it themselves. Enter the Jewish moneylenders, who were simultaneously essential to the economic machinery and despised for performing an essential service. It's a bit like hating your plumber while your basement is flooding. Irrational, but apparently very human. This environment produced individuals with a particular set of skills acquired over generations of necessity. Jews became experts in assessing risk, managing credit, moving money across borders, and navigating complex financial relationships. They developed extensive networks that stretched across Europe, because when your entire community is scattered across a continent and regularly expelled from one country only to relocate to another, you learn to maintain relationships across distances. They became multilingual out of necessity, fluent in Hebrew for religious purposes, Yiddish for daily communication, and whatever local language was required to conduct business. In short, centuries of discrimination had inadvertently created a population perfectly suited for international finance, not because of any inherent characteristic, but because finance was literally the only major economic sector they were allowed to occupy. Into this world, sometime around 1744, a boy named Meyer Amschel Rothschild was born. The exact date is uncertain, because record-keeping in the ghetto wasn't exactly a priority for the authorities. Shocking, I know. But we know he grew up in a house marked by a red shield, which in German is Rothschild. Yes, the family name comes from a house sign. This was actually common practice in the Judengasse, where addresses were identified by symbols rather than numbers. There was the house of the green shield, the house of the ship, the house of the frying pan. Real estate branding was apparently already a thing in the 18th century. Meyer Amschel's family had been associated with this particular house for generations, and the name stuck even after they moved to a different building. Sometimes your entire dynasty gets named after interior decorating choices made by your great-great-grandfather. Meyer Amschel's early life was marked by tragedy and hardship, which was essentially the default setting for ghetto residents. His father, Amschel Moses, was a small-time merchant and money changer, respectable enough by Judengasse standards, but hardly wealthy. Both of Meyer Amschel's parents died during a smallpox epidemic when he was around 11 or 12 years old, leaving him an orphan in a community that, despite its poverty, took care of its own. He was initially sent to study at a yeshiva in Fürth, suggesting his parents had hoped he might become a rabbi. The rabbinical path was one of the few prestigious careers available to Jews, and it came with genuine respect within the community. But Meyer Amschel's destiny lay elsewhere. After his parents' deaths, the funding for his religious education apparently dried up, and he was forced to seek apprenticeships in more practical fields. Here's where Meyer Amschel's story starts to diverge from the thousands of other orphaned Jewish boys in similar circumstances. He found a position with the firm of Wolf Jacob Oppenheimer in Hanover, a banking house connected to the powerful Oppenheimer family that had served the Habsburg court. This was essentially an unpaid internship in the financial sector, except instead of fetching coffee and learning to navigate corporate email, young Meyer Amschel was learning the intricacies of international trade, currency exchange, and how to deal with aristocratic clients without either offending them or getting swindled by them. The Oppenheimer connection gave him something invaluable, a glimpse into how the truly wealthy operated, how courts functioned, and how money moved at the highest levels of society. He was a ghetto kid getting a crash course in the economics of power. After several years in Hanover, Meyer Amschel returned to Frankfurt to take over his late father's small business. He started modestly, dealing in coins and antiques, which doesn't sound particularly glamorous, until you realize that coin collecting was the hobby of choice for European aristocrats who had more money than sense and needed ways to display their sophistication. Old coins, rare metals, and historical curiosities were the NFTs of the 18th century, except they were actually made of precious metals and had inherent value beyond what people agreed to pretend they were worth. Meyer Amschel had a genuine passion for numismatics, and he combined this with a shrewd understanding that selling collectibles to rich people was a fantastic way to build relationships with rich people. His big break came through his connection to Wilhelm, the heir to the Landgraviate of Hesse-Kassel, later known as Wilhelm IX, and eventually Elector Wilhelm I, German aristocratic naming conventions being roughly as confusing as their political structures. Wilhelm was a notorious coin collector, and Meyer Amschel managed to become one of his suppliers. This might seem like a trivial achievement, selling old coins to a prince, but it was actually a crucial foothold. Once you're selling coins to a prince, you're having conversations with a prince. Once you're having conversations with a prince, you can start suggesting other services you might provide. And Wilhelm was going to need a lot of financial services, because his family had stumbled into one of the most lucrative businesses in 18th century Europe, renting out soldiers. The Landgraviate of Hesse Castle had perfected the art of training professional soldiers and then leasing them to whoever was willing to pay. During the American Revolution, it was Hessian mercenaries, financed and provided by Wilhelm's family, who fought alongside the British against the colonists. The money was extraordinary. Wilhelm inherited a fortune estimated at around 40 million florins, making him one of the richest men in Europe at the time. But here's the thing about having enormous amounts of money in an era before electronic banking. You need someone to manage it, move it, invest it, and generally keep track of where it all is. Wilhelm already had established bankers, but Meyer Amschel was patient, persistent, and willing to provide services that the bigger banks considered beneath their dignity. Meyer Amschel understood something fundamental about wealth and power that would become the cornerstone of the Rothschild approach. The relationship matters more than any individual transaction. He offered Wilhelm better rates on currency exchanges. He found rare coins that Wilhelm desperately wanted for his collection. He was always available, always accommodating, never complained about difficult requests. He was building trust, one small favor at a time, while his competitors focused on larger, more prestigious clients. This was the long game, played by someone who understood that in a world where Jewish businessmen could be dismissed or expelled at any moment, your value to powerful patrons was your only real security. By the 1780s, Meyer Amschel had become one of Wilhelm's official court factors, essentially a licensed financial agent permitted to conduct business on behalf of the prince. This was a significant achievement for a ghetto Jew, granting him protections and privileges that most of his neighbors could only dream of. But Meyer Amschel wasn't content with personal advancement. He had 5 sons, Amschel, Solomon, Nathan, Karl, and Jakob, who later went by James. And he was already planning how to leverage his position into something that would outlast his own lifetime. The Rothschild strategy was taking shape. Family unity above all else, geographical expansion through trusted relatives, and the accumulation of relationships with the powerful that could be converted into financial opportunities when the moment was right. The moment, as it turned out, was about to arrive with spectacular force. The French Revolution was brewing, and soon Napoleon would march his armies across Europe, redrawing borders, toppling monarchies, and creating exactly the kind of chaos that makes certain people very, very rich. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, what matters is understanding where the Rothschilds came from. A cramped, impoverished ghetto where restrictions bred innovation, where persecution produced expertise, and where a boy named after a house sign learned that when you can't own land or practice trades, you learn to own something far more portable: relationships, knowledge, and the flow of money itself. The Judengasse would continue to constrain Jewish life in Frankfurt until Napoleon's forces dismantled its gates in 1796. Ironically, the same Napoleon whose wars would provide the Rothschilds their greatest opportunity. But by then, Meyer Amschel had already internalized a lesson that centuries of oppression had taught his people. Real wealth isn't what you hold in your hands, it's what you can move, manage, and multiply. Physical assets can be confiscated. Land can be seized. But expertise, networks, and the ability to make yourself indispensable to the powerful, those are assets that travel with you wherever you go. The ghetto hadn't just shaped Meyer Amschel Rothschild. It had created the perfect training ground for a family that would soon be financing the fate of nations. So we've established that Meyer Amschel Rothschild had built himself a nice little operation in Frankfurt, cozying up to German princes and becoming indispensable to one of Europe's wealthiest aristocrats. But here's the thing about building a financial empire during peacetime. It's slow, it's steady, and frankly, it's a bit boring. What the Rothschilds needed was chaos. And in 1789, chaos decided to show up in France, wearing a revolutionary cockade and carrying some very strong opinions about the monarchy. The French Revolution didn't just execute a king, it detonated the entire European order that had existed for centuries. Suddenly, every crowned head on the continent was nervously touching their neck and wondering if maybe they should have been nicer to the peasants. But the real fireworks started when a short Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte decided that France was thinking too small, and that what Europe really needed was someone to reorganize it at gunpoint. What followed was over 2 decades of continental warfare that killed millions, redrew every map, and created financial opportunities that make modern investment banking look like a lemonade stand. Now here's where most people would see devastation, refugees, and collapsing economies. The Rothschilds saw a business model. And not just any business model. They pioneered what we might call the "why choose" approach to conflict financing. While Napoleon's armies were marching across Europe toppling governments, and Britain was desperately trying to build coalitions to stop him, the Rothschilds realized something profound. Wars are expensive. Like really expensive. Like, we need to borrow money from literally anyone who has it, expensive. And if you're the family that has the money and the networks to move it across hostile borders, suddenly everyone wants to be your friend. The traditional story, the one that's been repeated so often it's basically historical wallpaper, is that the Rothschilds simply backed Britain and made a fortune when Napoleon lost. That's not wrong, exactly. But it's like saying Elon Musk made his money by selling cars. Technically accurate, dramatically incomplete. The Rothschilds didn't just pick a winning side. They created a system where they would profit regardless of which side won. This wasn't gambling. It was running the casino. Let's talk about how this actually worked, because it's genuinely brilliant in a morally ambiguous kind of way. Napoleon's wars created massive demand for gold. Armies need to be paid, supplies need to be purchased, and despite what some optimists believed, you couldn't actually pay soldiers with revolutionary enthusiasm forever. Britain had gold. Lots of it, thanks to its colonial empire and the fact that it hadn't been invaded lately. But Britain's allies on the continent needed that gold to fund their own armies against Napoleon, and shipping gold across a Europe controlled by French forces was, shall we say, logistically challenging. This is where Nathan Rothschild, the third of Meyer Amschel's 5 sons, enters our story like a financial hurricane in a top hat. Nathan had moved to England around 1798, initially settling in Manchester to work in the textile trade. This might seem like an odd choice for a future banking titan, but it was actually strategic genius. The textile industry was booming thanks to the Industrial Revolution, and Manchester was ground zero for British manufacturing. Nathan learned the import-export business, built contacts, accumulated capital, and, most importantly, established himself as a legitimate businessman in Britain, not just another foreign Jewish money changer, but someone who contributed to the British economy. By the time the wars really heated up, Nathan had relocated to London and was ready to play in the big leagues. The British government had a problem. They needed to get gold to their allies, the Portuguese, the Spanish resistance, the various German states fighting Napoleon, but the French Navy and French armies made direct shipment essentially suicidal. Enter the Rothschild network. Nathan could acquire gold in London. His brother James, who had established himself in Paris, could facilitate transactions even in enemy territory because, well, everyone needed financial services, including the French. Solomon was building connections in Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire and France's most persistent continental enemy. Karl would eventually handle operations in Italy. And Amschel kept the Frankfurt operation running, maintaining relationships with the German princes who were alternatively fighting Napoleon, surrendering to Napoleon, or pretending to be neutral while secretly hoping someone else would deal with Napoleon. What the Rothschilds created was essentially an 18th-century wire transfer system that happened to work across battle lines. Gold would flow from Britain through a complex network of agents, intermediaries, and family members, eventually reaching Wellington's army in Spain or Austrian coffers in Vienna. The family charged handsomely for this service, naturally, but they weren't just earning fees. They were positioning themselves at the center of European finance. Every transaction built relationships. Every successful delivery proved their reliability. Every government that used their services became a little more dependent on them. But here's the really clever part, and this is where the betting on all sides strategy becomes clear. The Rothschilds weren't ideologically committed to Britain winning. They weren't secretly rooting for Napoleon either. They were committed to one thing: the Rothschild family. Their information network, which we'll discuss more in the next section, meant they often knew the outcome of battles before governments did. They could position their investments accordingly. When British government bonds fell because people feared Napoleon might win, the Rothschilds bought. When they rose after victories, the Rothschilds sold. They made money on the volatility itself, not just on the final outcome. And they understood something that most people, even today, fail to grasp about war. The winner doesn't actually win. Not financially, anyway. The country that wins a major war inherits a devastated economy, massive debts, a traumatized population, and the bill for rebuilding everything that got destroyed. The loser is broke, obviously, but the winner is also broke. Just broke with better bragging rights. Both sides need to borrow money to rebuild. Both sides need financial services to reorganize their economies. Both sides need the Rothschilds. This came to a head with the famous, or infamous depending on your perspective, story of Waterloo. On June 18, 1815, Napoleon met his final defeat at the hands of Wellington and Blucher. The battle ended French dreams of European domination and ushered in a century of relative peace. It also made Nathan Rothschild spectacularly wealthy, though the details of exactly how have been debated, exaggerated, and mythologized ever since. The most dramatic version of the story claims that Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat a full day before the British government, thanks to the Rothschild courier network, and used this information to manipulate the London stock market, first selling, to create panic, then buying massively when prices collapsed, and finally profiting enormously when the news became official and prices recovered. Is this story completely accurate? Probably not in every detail. Did Nathan have advance information? Almost certainly. His network was genuinely faster than government communications. Did he use it to make money? That's what networks are for. The exact mechanics of what happened on the London Stock Exchange in those crucial days remain murky, and the most dramatic versions of the tale were often promoted by anti-Semites looking to paint the Rothschilds as scheming manipulators. But the underlying reality, that the Rothschilds had positioned themselves to profit enormously from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, is indisputable. By 1815, they were no longer just successful bankers. They were becoming the bankers to nations. Meyer Amschel Rothschild died in 1812, 3 years before Waterloo, which means he never saw the full flowering of what his family would become. But he left behind something more valuable than money, a strategy. On his deathbed, or so the family legend goes, and with the Rothschilds you're never quite sure where history ends and mythology begins, he gathered his sons and made them promise to stay united. "If you brothers stay together, nothing can stop you," he reportedly said. "United, you will be stronger than any of them." It sounds like something from a mediocre motivational poster, but the old man was onto something profound. Most wealthy families follow a predictable pattern. The founder builds the fortune, the children maintain it, the grandchildren squander it, and by the fourth generation everyone's fighting over who gets the vacation home. The Rothschilds rejected this trajectory entirely by doing something that seems obvious in retrospect, but was genuinely revolutionary at the time. They didn't divide the inheritance. Instead, they created a unified family enterprise with branches in multiple countries, all working together, all sharing information, all bound by blood, marriage, and mutual financial interest. Let's meet the 5 brothers who would turn their father's regional success into a continental empire. Amschel Meyer, the eldest, stayed in Frankfurt to run the original family bank and maintain relationships with the German courts. He was the steady one, the guardian of traditions, the brother who kept the home fires burning while his siblings conquered the world. Solomon moved to Vienna, the capital of the Habsburg Empire, where he would eventually become one of the most influential financiers in Austrian history. Not bad for someone who technically wasn't even allowed to own real estate in the city for most of his career. Nathan, as we've discussed, dominated London and turned the English branch into the most profitable of the entire network. Karl headed to Naples to handle southern Europe, eventually becoming banker to the Italian states and the Vatican, because apparently even the Pope needs a good accountant. And James, the youngest and arguably the most flamboyant, established himself in Paris, where he would survive multiple regime changes and become a legendary figure in French high society. This wasn't just geographic diversification. It was the creation of something the world had never seen before. Think about what business looked like in the early 19th century. Most enterprises were local affairs, maybe regional if you were ambitious. International trade existed, of course, but it was conducted through networks of independent merchants, each with their own interests and loyalties. There was nothing like a modern multinational corporation because the infrastructure didn't exist. No telecommunications, no standardized banking systems, no legal frameworks for international business operations. The Rothschilds essentially invented one through family ties. Here's how it worked in practice. Say the Austrian government needed a loan to rebuild after the Napoleonic Wars. Solomon in Vienna would negotiate the terms. But Solomon alone didn't have enough capital to fund a major government loan. Nobody did. So he would reach out to Nathan in London, James in Paris, Karl in Naples, and Amschel in Frankfurt. Each branch would contribute a portion of the capital. The risk was spread across the family network, and so were the profits. If the Austrian government defaulted, Not that anyone would let that happen when the Rothschilds were involved. The loss wouldn't destroy any single branch. Meanwhile, the family's collective resources meant they could take on financial projects that were simply too large for any individual banker, or even any individual country's banking sector. The information flow was equally important. Each brother maintained extensive networks of agents, correspondents, and informants. When something important happened anywhere in Europe, a change of government, a harvest failure, a military mobilization, the Rothschild network would transmit that information to all 5 branches faster than it would reach most government ministries. This wasn't just about courier pigeons and fast horses, though those certainly played a role. It was about having people everywhere who understood what mattered and how to communicate it quickly. The Rothschilds essentially ran a private intelligence service that happened to also be a bank. Consider the competitive advantage this created. A rival banker in London only knew what was happening in London, plus whatever filtered through from unreliable second-hand sources about the continent. Nathan Rothschild knew what his brothers in Vienna, Paris, Frankfurt, and Naples were seeing in real time. He could anticipate market movements, identify opportunities, and avoid disasters before his competitors even knew something was happening. In an era before the telegraph, before the telephone, before the internet, the Rothschilds had built the closest thing to a real-time global information network that existed anywhere in the world. And they used it ruthlessly. The family coat of arms, adopted as the brothers rose to prominence, features 5 arrows clutched in a fist, representing the 5 brothers united against the world. The motto reads, Concordia, Integritas, Industria. Harmony, integrity, industry. Though cynics might suggest, information, leverage, and strategic marriages would be more accurate. Because here's the other crucial element of the Rothschild strategy. They married each other. Not the brothers themselves, obviously, but their children. Between 1824 and 1877, of 58 marriages involving Rothschild descendants, fully half were between first cousins within the family. This might strike modern sensibilities as, well, concerning. But from a business perspective, it was coldly logical. Every marriage within the family kept wealth within the family. Every external marriage risked diluting control, sharing secrets, and creating divided loyalties. The result was a financial entity that operated like a single organism with 5 heads spread across a continent. When the French branch needed support, the English branch provided it. When Italian bonds looked risky, the family could shift resources to safer Austrian investments. When a government tried to pressure one branch with unfavorable terms, that branch could simply refuse, knowing the others would compensate for any lost business. No individual government could threaten them because they were bigger than any individual government's financial system. They had achieved something remarkable, too big to fail before the phrase was invented. By the 1820s, the 5 Rothschild banks were handling a significant portion of all government debt in Europe. They financed railways, mines, and industrial projects. They helped stabilize currencies and managed the complex financial aftermath of the Napoleonic era. When governments needed money, they came to the Rothschilds first. Not because the Rothschilds were the only option, but because they were the best option. Their rates were competitive, their networks were unmatched, and their reputation for discretion and reliability was absolute. You could trust the Rothschilds to keep your financial secrets, to deliver on their promises, and to have your money when you needed it. Of course, all of this success came with costs. The family's visibility made them targets for resentment, conspiracy theories, and outright hatred, something we'll address later. Their intermarriage practices eventually created health problems as genetic diversity narrowed. Their relentless focus on the family business meant personal happiness was often sacrificed on the altar of commercial strategy. But in terms of pure financial achievement, what Meyer Amschel's 5 sons built between 1810 and 1830 was unprecedented. They had taken a modest money-changing operation in a German ghetto and transformed it into the first true transnational financial corporation in history. The world had never seen anything like it, and in many ways, it still hasn't. We've talked about how the Rothschilds built their network, how they positioned themselves on all sides of the Napoleonic Wars, and how the 5 brothers created something resembling a 19th-century multinational corporation. But none of that would have worked without the secret ingredient that made the whole operation hum: information. And I don't mean information in the general sense of knowing stuff. I mean information as a tradable commodity, as a competitive weapon, as the single most valuable asset in an era when most people got their news whenever someone on a horse felt, like showing up. To understand why the Rothschild information network was so revolutionary, you need to appreciate just how terrible communication was in the early 1800s. There was no telegraph. That wouldn't become practical until the 1840s. No telephones, obviously. No internet, no email, no texting your brother in Vienna to ask what the Austrian government is planning. If you wanted to send a message from London to Paris, your options were basically put it on a ship, hope the ship doesn't sink, and wait weeks for a response. Or find someone with a fast horse and a strong stomach for bad roads, and hope they don't get robbed, arrested, or decide your message isn't important enough to deliver on time. The average speed of information travel was, generously, maybe 50 miles a day under good conditions. Under bad conditions, winter, war, flooded roads, it could take months for news to cross the continent. The Rothschilds looked at this situation and thought, what if we just did it better than everyone else? And then they did. The family built what was essentially a private postal system that operated parallel to, and significantly faster than, government mail services. They employed a network of dedicated couriers who traveled set routes between the 5 Rothschild banking houses, carrying encrypted messages in specially designed pouches. These weren't just random messengers. They were trained professionals who knew multiple routes, could navigate political borders with minimal delay, and understood that their job was to get information from point A to point B as fast as humanly possible. The courier network was impressive, but the real secret weapon was the carrier pigeons. Yes, those birds that today are mostly known for annoying tourists in city squares and carrying various diseases were once the cutting edge of communication technology. The Rothschilds maintained flocks of homing pigeons at strategic locations across Europe. When something important happened, a battle, a government announcement, a market-moving event, a pigeon could carry a tiny rolled-up message across hundreds of miles in hours, not days. This was the 19th century equivalent of having a private fiber optic network when everyone else was using dial-up. The birds weren't reliable in bad weather and could only carry short messages, but for time-sensitive financial intelligence, they were unbeatable. And the family didn't just move information fast, they protected it. The Rothschilds developed elaborate codes and ciphers for their correspondence, turning sensitive business communications into incomprehensible gibberish that only family members could decode. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical necessity. Government officials routinely opened and read private mail, especially mail from wealthy Jewish bankers who might be up to something interesting. Competitors would pay good money for Rothschild business intelligence. The family's codes ensured that even if a message was intercepted, it would be useless to anyone without the key. Some of these coded letters have survived, and historians still haven't cracked all of them, which is either impressive security or evidence that the Rothschilds were just writing grocery lists in cipher to mess with future researchers. The Waterloo story, which we touched on earlier, perfectly illustrates how this system worked in practice. The battle took place on June 18, 1815. The official British government courier, carrying news of Wellington's victory, didn't arrive in London until late on June 21st, more than 3 days after the fighting ended. Nathan Rothschild, according to multiple accounts, knew the outcome by June 20th at the latest, possibly earlier. His agent in Belgium, a man named Rothworth, had witnessed the battle's conclusion and immediately dispatched the news through the Rothschild network, probably using a combination of fast courier boats across the channel and waiting messengers who relayed the information to London. Now, what Nathan actually did with this advanced knowledge has been debated, exaggerated, and mythologized for 2 centuries. The most dramatic version claims he manipulated the stock market through elaborate deception, but the verified facts are interesting enough without embellishment. Nathan appeared at his usual spot at the London Stock Exchange on June 20th, looking characteristically unreadable. The man was famous for revealing nothing through his expression, and began trading. Whether he bought, sold, or did both in sequence, the result was that when the official news arrived and the market reacted, Nathan had positioned himself to profit substantially. One day's head start in the markets of 1815 was worth a fortune. But here's what's often missed in the Waterloo story. This wasn't a one-time trick. This was standard operating procedure. The Rothschilds were doing this constantly, for decades, with every major event across Europe. When revolution threatened in one country, they knew before markets could react. When harvests failed in another, they adjusted their positions before prices moved. When governments secretly negotiated treaties or planned military actions, Rothschild agents often heard whispers before the ink was dry. The family had effectively built Bloomberg Terminal in an era of quill pens and sealing wax. The information advantage compounded over time. Because the Rothschilds consistently had better information, they consistently made better trades. Because they made better trades, they accumulated more capital. Because they had more capital, they could afford to maintain and expand their information network. It was a virtuous cycle that their competitors simply couldn't match. A rival banker might hire faster couriers or acquire some pigeons of his own, but he couldn't replicate the integrated network that connected 5 major financial centers, each staffed by family members who shared information freely and trusted each another completely. By the 1830s, the Rothschild courier network was so sophisticated that governments began using it themselves. That's right. The same governments that officially ran postal monopolies started routing their most urgent diplomatic correspondence through Rothschild channels because the family could guarantee faster, more reliable delivery than official state services. The British Foreign Office reportedly used Rothschild couriers for sensitive communications. This gave the family yet another advantage. They were literally carrying government secrets, which meant they were often aware of diplomatic developments before they became public knowledge. It's like if Amazon started delivering classified Pentagon documents and happened to notice what was in them. The information network eventually became so valuable that it evolved into something beyond mere financial intelligence. In 1849, Paul Julius Reuter, yes, that Reuters, actually worked for a Rothschild-backed venture using carrier pigeons to bridge a gap in the telegraph network between Brussels and Aachen. He later founded the Reuters news agency, which would become one of the world's dominant information services. The Rothschilds didn't directly create Reuters, but their demonstration of how valuable fast information could be helped inspire an entire industry. They proved that whoever controls the flow of information controls the outcome of events, a principle that remains just as true in the age of algorithmic trading as it was in the age of carrier pigeons. So we've established that the Rothschilds had more money than most countries and better information than most intelligence services. The question becomes, what do you do with all that wealth and knowledge? If you're a normal rich person, maybe you buy some nice houses, collect art, throw parties, and gradually watch your descendants fritter away the family fortune on bad investments and expensive divorces. If you're the Rothschilds, you start buying the infrastructure of the modern world. The 19th century was the era of massive infrastructure projects: railways, canals, telegraph lines, ports. These were the physical arteries through which trade, information, and ultimately wealth flowed. Governments understood that infrastructure was crucial, but governments had a problem. Infrastructure was expensive. Really, catastrophically expensive. Building a railway line required enormous upfront capital investment, and most governments were already in debt from the Napoleonic Wars and various other adventures in fiscal irresponsibility. They needed private financing, and the Rothschilds were ready to provide it. At a price. The family began investing in railways in the 1830s, and by mid-century, they had financial interests in rail networks across virtually the entire European continent. The Northern Railway of France, connecting Paris to the Belgian border, was largely a Rothschild project. The Austrian railway system expanded significantly with Rothschild backing. Italian railways, Spanish railways, even early attempts at rail development in the Balkans. The family had fingers in all of them. They weren't just passive investors either. The Rothschilds often had significant say in route planning, station locations, and operational decisions. When you control the financing, you control the project. Think about what this meant in practical terms. If you wanted to build a railway in 1840s Europe, you probably needed Rothschild money to do it. If you needed Rothschild money, you needed Rothschild approval. And the Rothschilds would only approve projects that made financial sense, which also happened to be projects that enhanced their own economic and political position. They could essentially determine which regions developed economically and which remained backwaters. A city that got a railway station became a commercial hub. A city that didn't got left behind. The family wasn't technically picking winners and losers, but they were creating the conditions that determined who would win and who would lose. Railways also generated extraordinary intelligence opportunities. The same physical infrastructure that moved trains also moved information. First, through the couriers who used railway networks for faster travel, and later through telegraph lines that often ran alongside railway tracks. The Rothschilds' investments in railways gave them intimate knowledge of which routes were being built, where stations would be located, and how traffic patterns were developing. They could predict regional economic growth before it happened because they were literally building the systems that would cause it. But the single most dramatic example of Rothschild infrastructure financing came in 1875 with the Suez Canal. The canal, completed in 1869 after a decade of construction, was one of the engineering marvels of the age. A 100-mile artificial waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and cutting thousands of miles off the shipping route between Europe and Asia. The canal was operated by a French-dominated company, but the Khedive of Egypt, the country's Ottoman-appointed ruler, owned a significant stake, about 44% of the shares. In November 1875, the Khedive was in financial trouble. Egypt had been spending lavishly on modernization projects and accumulating debt at an alarming rate. The Khedive needed cash, quickly, and he decided to sell his Suez Canal shares. The French were the obvious buyers, but negotiations moved slowly. The British government, under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, saw an opportunity. Control of the Suez Canal was becoming increasingly important to British strategic interests. The canal was the shortest route to India, the crown jewel of the British Empire. If Britain could acquire the Khedive's shares, they would have a major voice in canal operations and could prevent French domination of this vital waterway. There was just one problem. Parliament wasn't in session, and Disraeli couldn't authorize the expenditure through normal channels. The purchase price was about £4 million, somewhere in the range of several $100 million in today's money, and the British government needed to move immediately before the French finalized their own deal. Disraeli turned to the one financial entity he knew could produce that kind of money on a moment's notice: Lionel de Rothschild, head of the London branch, and Nathan's son. The conversation, according to various accounts that may be somewhat embellished, went roughly like this. Disraeli's secretary, Montague Corey, visited Lionel at New Court, the Rothschild banking headquarters in London. "The Prime Minister wants £4 million, Corey said, tomorrow." Lionel de Rothschild reportedly asked what security the government was offering. "The British government," Corey replied. Lionel considered this for a moment, then said, "You shall have it." And that was that. Within 24 hours, the Rothschilds had provided the British Empire with enough money to purchase a controlling stake in one of the most important shipping routes on Earth. The loan was eventually repaid, with interest, and Parliament retroactively approved the purchase. Disraeli became a hero for securing British control of the canal. But the episode revealed something profound about the relationship between the Rothschilds and nation-states. A private family bank had just financed a major geopolitical acquisition faster than the government itself could authorize it. The British Empire, the most powerful political entity on the planet, had been unable to act without Rothschild cooperation. This wasn't just banking, it was power. Real, tangible, nation-shaping power. The Suez deal cemented the Rothschilds' reputation as something more than mere bankers. They were kingmakers, infrastructure builders, the hidden force behind thrones and parliaments. Their money had helped determine the outcome of wars, the development of continents, and now the control of global shipping lanes. They had transcended the traditional role of finance and become something unprecedented. A private entity with the resources and influence to shape the course of history according to their own interests. Of course, this kind of power attracts attention, not all of it positive. As the Rothschild empire grew, so did the resentment, suspicion, and outright hatred directed at the family. Their success would become the foundation for some of history's most persistent and destructive conspiracy theories. But that, as they say, is a story for later. For now, what matters is understanding that by the 1870s, the Rothschilds weren't just participants in the global economy. They were architects of it, literally financing the physical systems through which modern capitalism operated. So far, we've been telling a story that's almost admiring in its tone. Scrappy underdogs from a German ghetto outsmart the establishment, build an unprecedented financial empire, and reshape the world through sheer intelligence and family unity. It's a compelling narrative, and it's not entirely wrong. But here's where we need to pump the brakes and acknowledge something important. The Rothschilds didn't build their fortune in a vacuum. They built it within a system. 19th century capitalism intertwined with European imperialism. And that system was, to put it mildly, not great for a lot of people. Specifically, it was catastrophic for the millions of Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples who found themselves on the receiving end of colonial exploitation. And the Rothschilds, for all their own experience with discrimination and persecution, were very much participants in that exploitation. Nowhere is this more evident than in the family's involvement with the South African diamond and gold mining industries, and particularly their relationship with one of history's most controversial figures, Cecil Rhodes. If you don't know who Cecil Rhodes was, imagine a 19th century tech bro with unlimited funding, no ethical oversight committee, and a genuine belief that conquering Africa was doing Africans a favor. Rhodes was a British imperialist who dreamed of painting the map of Africa red, British red, from Cape Town to Cairo. He founded the colony of Rhodesia, which tells you something about his modesty, and he created the De Beers Diamond Company, which to this day controls a significant portion of the global diamond market. He was also a raging racist who believed that Anglo-Saxons were divinely ordained to rule the world, which he stated openly and frequently in ways that make modern readers deeply uncomfortable. Now, Cecil Rhodes had big dreams, but big dreams require big money. And in the 1880s and 1890s, when Rhodes was consolidating his control over South African mining, the biggest money in Europe belonged to the Rothschilds. The family had been investing in mining operations for decades. They had significant interests in Spanish mercury mines, various European copper and lead operations, and were always looking for new opportunities in resource extraction. South Africa, with its seemingly endless deposits of diamonds and gold, was irresistible. The Rothschilds' involvement with De Beers began in the 1880s, when Rhodes was engaged in a brutal corporate war to monopolize the diamond industry. Multiple companies were competing for control of the Kimberley diamond fields, and Rhodes was buying them out one by one. The biggest obstacle was a rival company called Kimberley Central, controlled by a businessman named Barney Barnado. Rhodes needed capital to win this fight, and he turned to Lord Rothschild, Nathaniel, the first Baron Rothschild, great-grandson of Meyer Amschel, for financing. The Rothschilds provided Rhodes with the backing he needed, and in 1888, De Beers Consolidated Mines was formed, with effective control over roughly 90% of global diamond production. The family received shares in the new company, establishing a financial relationship that would last for over a century. This was, from a pure investment standpoint, spectacularly successful. De Beers would go on to become one of the most profitable monopolies in business history, controlling diamond prices through careful management of supply and creating the modern diamond engagement ring industry essentially from scratch. The famous slogan, "A diamond is forever," was actually coined by an advertising agency in 1947, but the groundwork, the artificial scarcity, the careful marketing, the transformation of a sparkly rock into an emotional necessity was laid decades ago. Earlier with Rothschild money backing the operation. But here's where things get uncomfortable. The diamond mines of South Africa weren't staffed by well-compensated union workers with health benefits and reasonable hours. They were worked primarily by black African laborers under conditions that ranged from exploitative to genuinely horrific. The compound system, which De Beers pioneered, confined workers to enclosed camps for the duration of their contracts, often 3 to 6 months, where they lived in crowded barracks, were subject to invasive searches to prevent diamond theft, and had virtually no rights or legal protections. Workers were recruited from across southern Africa, often through coercive practices that bordered on forced labor. They were paid a fraction of what white workers received for comparable work, and workplace deaths from accidents and disease were grimly common. This wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. The profitability of South African mining depended entirely on cheap African labor, and cheap African labor was maintained through a combination of colonial laws, pass systems, land dispossession, and outright coercion. The mineral wealth that enriched European investors, including the Rothschilds, was extracted quite literally from the bodies of African workers who had no meaningful choice about their participation. Cecil Rhodes didn't invent colonialism, but he perfected the industrial-scale extraction of African resources using African labor for European benefit. And he couldn't have done it without European capital. Did the Rothschilds know what was happening in the mines they financed? Almost certainly, at least in general terms. The conditions in South African mining were not secret. They were documented by observers, debated in Parliament, and defended by mining companies as economically necessary. The Rothschilds were sophisticated investors who conducted due diligence on their ventures. The idea that they were unaware of basic operational realities strains credibility. More likely, they knew and considered it an acceptable cost of doing business, or simply didn't consider the welfare of African workers to be their concern. This wasn't unusual for the era. It was the default assumption of European capitalism that colonial labor practices were someone else's problem. The Rothschilds' involvement extended beyond De Beers. They also invested in South African gold mining, which used similar labor practices. And they had interests in mining operations across the African continent. The family financed railway construction in Africa, which sounds benign until you realize that colonial railways were designed primarily to move extracted resources to coastal ports for export to Europe. They were tools of extraction, not development. The Rothschilds weren't uniquely evil in participating in colonial exploitation. They were simply very good at it, and their capital reached further than most. It's worth pausing here to note the historical irony. The Rothschilds themselves had experienced centuries of persecution, discrimination, and violence. They knew what it meant to be treated as less than fully human by a dominant culture. They had built their fortune partly because anti-Semitic laws excluded them from other economic activities. And yet, when they had the power and resources to shape how capitalism operated, they participated in a system that treated another group of people, Africans, as disposable labor to be exploited for profit. This isn't to suggest some special hypocrisy. It's to observe that victimhood in one context doesn't automatically produce solidarity with victims in another. The Rothschilds were products of their time, and their time was one of unquestioned European supremacy. Cecil Rhodes died in 1902, leaving behind a complicated legacy of infrastructure, exploitation, and the Rhodes Scholarship, which continues to fund students at Oxford University to this day, generating periodic debates about whether it's appropriate to accept money from such a source. The Rothschilds maintained their stake in De Beers for generations, finally selling their remaining shares only in the early 2000s. The family made enormous profits from the diamond trade over more than a century, wealth that contributed to their continued prominence in global finance. The gold mining connection deserves its own mention. The discovery of massive gold deposits in the Witwatersrand region in 1886 triggered a gold rush that would transform South Africa and create fortunes for European investors. The Rothschilds were significant players in this industry as well, financing mining operations and infrastructure development. Gold mining was even more labor-intensive than diamond mining, and the industry developed increasingly sophisticated systems for controlling and exploiting African workers. The migrant labor system, the pass laws, the compound housing, all of these would eventually become foundational elements of the apartheid system that governed South Africa from 1948 to 1994. The Rothschilds didn't create apartheid, but they profited from the economic structures that made it possible. None of this is meant to single out the Rothschilds as uniquely villainous. They were one of many European financial families who invested in colonial enterprises, and their investments followed the same logic as everyone else's. Resources in Africa were valuable, labor in Africa was cheap, and the moral implications were somebody else's department. But the Rothschilds' prominence, their visibility as the most famous banking family in the world, makes them an important case study in how wealth accumulation in the 19th century was inseparable from colonial exploitation. You couldn't be a major player in global finance during this period without being complicit in imperialism, because imperialism was how global finance operated. The family did engage in significant philanthropy, which we'll discuss later, and individual Rothschilds supported various humanitarian causes. But philanthropy doesn't erase the source of the wealth being donated. The schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions funded by Rothschild money were built, in part, on profits extracted from African miners working in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic of historical wealth. The beautiful museums and generous endowments often have ugly origins that get sanitized over time. For viewers wondering why this matters today, consider that the structures created during this period didn't simply disappear when colonialism officially ended. The economic patterns established in the 19th century, African countries exporting raw resources while importing finished goods, wealth concentrated in the hands of foreign investors and local elites, labor systems designed to keep wages low, persisted throughout the 20th century and continue to shape global economics today. The Rothschilds were architects of a system whose effects are still being felt by millions of people. Understanding their role helps us understand why the world's wealth remains so unequally distributed. This chapter isn't meant to be a morality tale or a condemnation. It's meant to complicate the narrative, to remind us that financial genius and moral blindness often coexist in the same individuals and institutions. The Rothschilds were brilliant, innovative, and remarkably successful. They were also willing participants in one of history's greatest injustices. Both things can be true simultaneously. The question of how we judge them, how we judge any historical figure whose achievements were entangled with exploitation, is one that each viewer will have to answer for themselves. But we can't answer it honestly without first acknowledging the full picture of what they did and how they did it. After that rather heavy chapter on diamonds and colonialism, you might be thinking the Rothschilds were purely profit-driven machines with no concern for human welfare. And honestly, that would be an understandable takeaway. But the picture is more complicated than that, because the same family that profited from African mining operations also became some of the most generous philanthropists of the 19th century. The question is, why? Was it genuine compassion, strategic reputation management, or some combination that defies simple categorization? Welcome to the morally ambiguous world of Victorian charity, where doing good and doing well were often the same thing. The 1840s were a rough decade for Europe, and an absolutely catastrophic one for Ireland. Starting in 1845, a fungal disease called Phytophthora infestans swept through Irish potato crops, destroying the primary food source for millions of people. Now, Ireland's over-reliance on the potato wasn't an accident. It was the result of centuries of British colonial policies that had concentrated land ownership among Protestant landlords, pushed Catholic Irish farmers onto smaller and smaller plots, and created conditions where only the potato could produce enough calories per acre to keep families alive. When the blight hit, it didn't just cause a food shortage, it triggered a full-scale humanitarian disaster that would kill approximately 1 million people and force another million to emigrate, reducing Ireland's population by roughly 25% in less than a decade. The British government's response to the famine was, to put it diplomatically, inadequate. To put it less diplomatically, it was a masterclass in how not to handle a humanitarian crisis, combining ideological rigidity, bureaucratic incompetence, and a generous helping of ethnic prejudice. Many British officials believed that providing too much relief would create dependency among the Irish poor, which is a bit like refusing to throw a life preserver to someone drowning because it might discourage them from learning to swim. The government did eventually establish public works programs and soup kitchens, but these were often too little, too late, and administered with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for filling out tax forms. Into this disaster stepped private charity, and the Rothschilds were among the most prominent donors. Lionel de Rothschild, who headed the London branch at this point, became one of the leading contributors to the British Association for the Relief of Extreme Distress in Ireland and Scotland. Yes, that was the actual name, because Victorians believed that if a charitable organization's title didn't induce drowsiness, it wasn't serious enough. The organization raised substantial funds to provide food, clothing, and other relief to famine victims, and the Rothschild family's contributions were widely publicized. Why would a Jewish banking family based in London care about starving Irish Catholics? The cynical answer is reputation. The Rothschilds were, at this point, the most visible Jewish family in Britain, and possibly in the world. They were also engaged in a long-running campaign to achieve full civil rights for British Jews, including the right to sit in Parliament, which required swearing a Christian oath that observant Jews couldn't take. Lionel de Rothschild had been elected to Parliament multiple times, but couldn't actually take his seat because of this requirement. Being seen as generous benefactors to Christian victims of disaster was excellent public relations for a family fighting anti-Semitic prejudice. But cynicism doesn't tell the whole story. The Rothschilds had their own experience with persecution and displacement, and there's evidence that family members felt genuine sympathy for people facing similar circumstances. Jewish religious tradition emphasizes tzedakah, charitable giving, as a moral obligation, not merely a nice thing to do when you have spare cash. The Rothschilds funded Jewish schools, hospitals, and community organizations throughout Europe. Extending their philanthropy to non-Jewish causes might have been a natural evolution of values they already held. The truth is, probably, that multiple motivations coexisted: genuine compassion, strategic calculation, religious obligation, and social positioning, all operating simultaneously. The family's charitable activities extended well beyond famine relief. The Rothschilds became major patrons of housing development for the working poor, a somewhat ironic choice given that their banking activities had contributed to the industrial capitalism that created urban poverty in the first place. But let's not get too cynical. In London, they funded the construction of model dwellings, apartment buildings designed to provide decent sanitary housing for working-class families at affordable rents. These weren't luxury accommodations, but they were vastly superior to the typical slum housing where most poor Londoners lived. The buildings had running water, proper drainage, and ventilation, Amenities that seem basic today but were genuinely revolutionary in an era when cholera outbreaks were regular occurrences and the Thames River was essentially an open sewer. Lionel de Rothschild also contributed significantly to helping Scottish Highlanders who had been displaced by the clearances, a process in which landlords evicted tenant farmers to make way for more profitable sheep grazing. Yes, people were being kicked off their ancestral lands so that sheep could have more room. Scottish agricultural policy in the 19th century was essentially a real estate development scheme that treated human beings as inconvenient obstacles to wool production. The Rothschilds helped fund emigration for some of these displaced families, providing passage to British colonies where they could start new lives. Now, here's where it gets complicated again. Where were these emigrants going? To colonies like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, territories that the British Empire was actively settling and developing. The Rothschilds had financial interests in colonial development, including investments in colonial infrastructure and resources. Helping displaced Europeans emigrate to the colonies wasn't just charity. It was also labor supply for colonial enterprises. The immigrants would become workers, farmers, and consumers in territories where Rothschild-financed railroads were being built and Rothschild-backed mining operations were extracting resources. Philanthropy and profit weren't necessarily opposed. They could be mutually reinforcing. This pattern was common among Victorian philanthropists. The era's great charitable givers, the Rothschilds, the Peabodys, the Carnegies who would come later, often directed their generosity in ways that happened to align with their business interests. Building housing for workers created a more stable, healthier workforce. Funding immigration populated colonies that needed settlers. Establishing schools and libraries produced literate, trained employees. None of this means that philanthropy wasn't genuine or valuable to its recipients. It absolutely was. But it also wasn't purely selfless in the way modern charity is sometimes imagined to be. The Rothschilds' most lasting philanthropic legacy, however, might be in the arts and sciences. The family became legendary collectors and patrons, amassing art collections that would eventually fill museums, funding scientific research, and supporting cultural institutions across Europe. The Natural History Museum in London contains specimens from Rothschild-funded expeditions. The Waddesdon Manor Collection, assembled by Ferdinand de Rothschild and now maintained by the National Trust, includes some of the finest examples of French decorative arts in existence. The family didn't just collect beautiful things. They funded the exploration, research, and preservation that made such collections possible. Walter Rothschild, a member of the English branch born in 1868, became one of the most eccentric naturalists of his era. He assembled a private zoological museum at Tring that eventually contained over 2 million specimens, including 300,000 bird skins, 200,000 bird eggs, and collections of butterflies, beetles, and mammals that researchers still use today. He also famously drove a carriage pulled by zebras through London, because when you're a Rothschild, conventional horses are apparently too pedestrian. Walter's museum was donated to the British Museum and remains open to the public, a genuinely magnificent contribution to scientific knowledge that happened to be funded by diamond and gold mining profits. The family also became significant supporters of Jewish causes worldwide, funding schools, synagogues, and community institutions from Eastern Europe to Palestine. This would eventually evolve into support for the Zionist movement, the effort to establish a Jewish homeland, which we'll discuss later. But even before Zionism became a major political movement, the Rothschilds were investing in Jewish communities and institutions, driven by a combination of religious identity, family tradition, and recognition that Jewish communities often lacked, resources that Christian communities took for granted. How should we evaluate 19th century philanthropy in general, and Rothschild philanthropy in particular? Modern critics sometimes dismiss it as conscience laundering, using charitable giving to offset the moral costs of how wealth was accumulated. There's something to this critique. The same economic system that created Rothschild wealth also created the poverty that Rothschild charities attempted to address. Building model housing for workers doesn't change the fact that worker housing was terrible because wages were suppressed and landlords were unregulated. Funding famine relief doesn't change the fact that colonial economic policies created the conditions for famine. But there's also something uncomfortable about judging historical actors by standards they couldn't have met. The Rothschilds operated within a capitalist system they didn't invent and couldn't unilaterally reform. Within that system, they chose to use significant portions of their wealth for purposes that benefited people other than themselves. The recipients of their charity, the Irish families who received food aid, The Scottish emigrants who got passage to new lives, the London workers who moved into decent housing, experienced real improvements in their circumstances. Dismissing that as mere reputation management seems to miss something important about what actually happened. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Rothschild philanthropy was both genuine and strategic, both compassionate and self-interested, both admirable and insufficient. It reflected the moral limitations of its era, while also pushing against them in meaningful ways. The family gave away enormous sums that improved countless lives, even as they continued accumulating wealth through enterprises that harmed others. They were complicated people operating in a complicated system, and their charitable activities were as complicated as everything else they did. The institutions they funded, the hospitals, schools, museums, and housing developments, outlasted the 19th century and continue serving communities today. Whatever motivated the original giving, the results have been genuinely beneficial for millions of people across generations. That's not nothing. It might not be redemption, but it's not nothing. We've spent the last several chapters discussing how the Rothschilds accumulated wealth, built empires, and shaped the course of European history. But there's another side to this story, a darker, uglier side that runs parallel to all those achievements. Because as the Rothschilds grew richer and more powerful, they also became the target of something ancient and persistent: anti-Semitism. And not just casual prejudice or social exclusion, though there was plenty of that. The Rothschilds became the central figures in conspiracy theories that would echo through history, fuel political movements, and ultimately contribute to one of the greatest crimes humanity has ever committed. Here's the bitter irony at the heart of this chapter. The very success that made the Rothschilds remarkable also made them vulnerable. In a Europe where Jews had been persecuted for centuries, where they were blamed for everything from plagues to crop failures to the death of Jesus, a Jewish family achieving unprecedented wealth and influence was never going to be accepted without backlash. The Rothschilds proved that Jews could compete with and outperform Christian bankers, aristocrats, and even governments. For people who believed in Jewish inferiority, this was an uncomfortable fact that demanded explanation. And the explanation they reached for wasn't, maybe our prejudices were wrong. It was, there must be something sinister going on. The conspiracy theories started almost as soon as the Rothschilds became prominent. By the 1820s and 1830s, pamphlets were circulating across Europe accusing the family of controlling governments, manipulating wars, and orchestrating economic crises for their own benefit. Some of these accusations had a kernel of distorted truth. The Rothschilds did have significant influence over government finances, and they did profit from wars. But the theories transformed legitimate criticism of banking practices into something far more sinister: the idea that a secret Jewish cabal was pulling the strings of world events. The Waterloo legend we discussed earlier became particularly toxic in this context. The story of Nathan Rothschild learning about Napoleon's defeat before anyone else and using that information to manipulate the stock market was bad enough when presented as clever business practice. But anti-Semitic propagandists embellished and distorted it into something monstrous. In their telling, Nathan didn't just profit from advance information. He deliberately spread false rumors of British defeat, caused a market panic, bought up government bonds at rock-bottom prices, and then revealed the true outcome to make a killing. Some versions claimed he made the equivalent of billions in a single day through this deception. The actual historical evidence for this elaborate scheme is thin at best, but that didn't matter. The story confirmed what anti-Semites already believed: that Jews were inherently deceitful, that their success came through trickery rather than merit, and that they would exploit Christian misfortune without remorse. What made these conspiracy theories so persistent was their flexibility. Whatever happened in the world, economic crisis, political upheaval, war, revolution, could be attributed to Rothschild manipulation. If markets crashed, clearly the Rothschilds had engineered it to buy assets cheaply. If markets boomed, clearly the Rothschilds were inflating a bubble to profit when it burst. If governments went to war, the Rothschilds must be financing both sides to collect interest, regardless of who won. If peace prevailed, the Rothschilds must be preventing wars that would threaten their investments. Every outcome confirmed the theory because the theory was designed to be unfalsifiable. It was the original heads I win, tails you lose of prejudice-based reasoning. The family found themselves in an impossible position. If they responded to accusations, they drew more attention to them. If they ignored accusations, their silence was interpreted as tacit admission. If they engaged in philanthropy, Critics said they were trying to buy respectability or distract from their crimes. If they kept their wealth private, critics said they were hoarding it secretively. The Rothschilds literally could not win because the game was rigged against them from the start. Anti-Semitism isn't a logical position that can be argued away with evidence. It's a prejudice that interprets all evidence to confirm itself. The political dimensions became increasingly dangerous as the 19th century progressed. Anti-Semitic politicians and movements across Europe used the Rothschilds as symbols of everything they claimed to oppose. International finance, cosmopolitan elites, Jewish influence, the erosion of traditional Christian society. In France, the Rothschilds were attacked by both left and right, by socialists who saw them as capitalist exploiters, and by conservatives who saw them as rootless cosmopolitans undermining French national identity. In Germany, the emerging Völkisch movement, which would eventually evolve into Nazism, identified the Rothschilds as the embodiment of Jewish power that needed to be destroyed. In Russia, the Rothschilds were blamed for everything from revolutionary movements to economic instability, contributing to the pogroms that killed thousands of Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. One of the most notorious anti-Semitic texts in history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, drew heavily on Rothschild conspiracy theories. This forged document, created by Russian secret police around 1903, purported to reveal a secret Jewish plan for world domination. While the protocols didn't mention the Rothschilds by name, the shadowy Jewish financiers described in its pages were clearly modeled on popular conceptions of the family. The protocols would become a foundational text for 20th century anti-Semitism, cited by everyone from Henry Ford to Adolf Hitler. And the Rothschild mythology was woven throughout its fabric. The Nazi regime took Rothschild hatred to its ultimate, horrifying conclusion. In 1940, the German film industry, fully controlled by the Nazi propaganda ministry, released Die Rothschilds, a viciously anti-Semitic movie that portrayed the family as scheming, greedy manipulators who profited from war while Christian soldiers died. The film depicted Nathan Rothschild using the Waterloo battle to defraud the British public, presented the family as physically repulsive caricatures, and explicitly connected their supposed crimes to the Jewish question that the Nazis claimed to be solving. It was released the same year as Jude Seuss, another anti-Semitic propaganda film, and both were used to prepare the German public for the Holocaust. The real Rothschilds, meanwhile, were experiencing Nazi persecution firsthand. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild, head of the Vienna branch, was arrested and held hostage. The Nazis demanded an enormous ransom and the surrender of all Rothschild properties in Austria, including the family's art collections, estates, and business interests. Louis was eventually released after 14 months of captivity and payment of what amounted to extortion. But the message was clear. Even the wealthiest, most connected Jewish family in Europe was not safe from Nazi barbarism. Family members scattered across the world. Some fled to England, where the British branch provided refuge. Others escaped to the United States or neutral countries. Those who couldn't escape, or chose not to, faced varying fates. Some Rothschilds in occupied France survived the war in hiding or through the protection of non-Jewish friends. Others were not so fortunate. While the family's wealth and connections allowed most members to escape, they lost relatives, friends, and countless members of the broader Jewish community to which they belonged. The Holocaust killed 6 million Jews, and the Rothschilds, for all their resources, could not prevent it. The irony, if such a word can be applied to such tragedy, is that the Rothschilds were never anything close to what the conspiracy theorists imagined. They were not a unified cabal controlling world events from shadowy boardrooms. By the 20th century, the family had fragmented into multiple branches with different interests, politics, and levels of wealth. Some Rothschilds were still prominent bankers. Others had become scientists, artists, or simply private citizens living off inherited wealth. The unified financial empire of the five brothers had long since dissolved into something much more ordinary. But the mythology persisted because it was never really about the actual Rothschilds. It was about the need for a scapegoat, a visible target onto which anxieties about modern capitalism, social change, and loss of traditional certainties could be projected. Understanding this dynamic is important because it didn't end with the Holocaust. Rothschild conspiracy theories persist to this day, recycled through internet forums, social media, and the darker corners of political discourse. When people claim that the Rothschilds control the world's banks, own every central bank, orchestrate wars for profit, or manipulate global events. They are repeating talking points that originated in 19th century anti-Semitic propaganda. The specific claims may have been updated. Now the conspiracies involve the Federal Reserve, the World Economic Forum, or whatever institution is currently being demonized. But the underlying structure is identical, a secret Jewish elite pulling strings behind the scenes. This isn't to say that wealthy families, including the Rothschilds, shouldn't be subject to criticism. The concentration of wealth, the influence of money in politics, the behavior of financial institutions, these are all legitimate topics for democratic debate. But there's a vast difference between critiquing capitalism or specific business practices and claiming that a Jewish family secretly controls the world. One is political analysis. The other is anti-Semitism dressed up in pseudo-analytical language. Learning to distinguish between them is a crucial skill in an era when conspiracy theories spread faster than ever before. The Rothschilds' response to anti-Semitism evolved over time. In the 19th century, they generally tried to integrate into elite society, seeking titles, intermarrying with aristocratic families when possible, and demonstrating their loyalty to their respective nations. This strategy had limited success. They achieved social acceptance in some circles while remaining targets of hatred in others. As persecution intensified, particularly in Eastern Europe, some family members became increasingly interested in Zionism, the movement to establish a Jewish homeland where Jews could live free from persecution. The Rothschild connection to Zionism would become one of the most significant chapters in family history, culminating in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, which we'll discuss later. But for now, what matters is understanding why the family turned in this direction. After centuries of trying to belong, of proving their value to European societies, of contributing to economies and cultures and charitable causes, they remained outsiders, tolerated in good times, scapegoated in bad times, never fully accepted. Zionism offered a different vision, a place where Jews wouldn't have to prove their worth to hostile majorities, where they could simply exist as a normal population in their own land. Whether that vision has been realized, and at what cost, remains hotly debated to this day. But the motivation behind it, the exhaustion of being perpetual targets, the recognition that assimilation was not providing security, the desire for a place of refuge, was shaped by exactly the kind of persecution this chapter has described. The Rothschilds didn't support Zionism because they were scheming to control the Middle East, as modern conspiracy theorists sometimes claim. They supported it because they were Jews who had experienced anti-Semitism at its most vicious, and wanted a future where their descendants might not have to. The previous chapter painted a grim picture of the anti-Semitism that shadowed the Rothschilds throughout their rise. But prejudice wasn't the only storm cloud gathering over the family in the early 20th century. The 1920s, which Americans remember as the Roaring Twenties, jazz, flappers, bootleg gin, and stock prices that only went up, were considerably less roaring in Europe. The continent was still recovering from World War I, which had killed millions, destroyed empires, and left victors and vanquished alike drowning in debt. And then, in October 1929, Wall Street crashed, and things got dramatically worse. The Great Depression is usually told as an American story. Bank failures, breadlines, Hoovervilles, and eventually the New Deal. But the Depression was a global catastrophe, and in many ways, its European chapter was even more devastating than its American one. The United States had abundant natural resources, an intact industrial base, and the advantage of geographic isolation from potential enemies. Europe had none of these luxuries. European nations were interconnected through trade, finance, and mutual suspicion in ways that meant economic contagion spread rapidly. When one domino fell, others followed. And in May 1931, the biggest domino in Central European finance came crashing down, the Kreditanstalt. The Kreditanstalt, officially the Kreditanstalt Bankverein, was Austria's largest and most prestigious bank. It had been founded in 1855 with significant involvement from the Rothschild family, specifically the Vienna branch, headed by Solomon von Rothschild, one of the original 5 brothers. For over 75 years, the Kreditanstalt had been the financial backbone of the Austrian economy, financing railroads, industrial development, and government operations. It was, in the parlance of our times, too big to fail, which, naturally, meant it was about to fail spectacularly. The bank's problems didn't emerge overnight. Throughout the 1920s, Kreditanstalt had absorbed several smaller, weaker banks, partly at the urging of the Austrian government, which was desperate to prevent a cascade of individual bank failures. This was essentially the same logic that led to too big to fail bailouts in 2008. Merge troubled institutions into larger ones and hope the bigger entity can absorb the losses. The problem, as any economist could tell you, though apparently not enough of them did at the time, is that merging weak banks doesn't create a strong bank. It creates a really big weak bank. By early 1931, Kreditanstalt balance sheet was a disaster. The bank had massive loans to industrial companies that couldn't repay them, real estate investments that had collapsed in value, and foreign debts that had become unmanageable as currencies fluctuated wildly. The Rothschilds, who still held significant stakes in the institution, were aware of the problems but hoped that economic recovery would bail them out before anyone noticed how bad things had gotten. This was essentially the financial equivalent of hoping your credit card bill would somehow pay itself if you just didn't look at it. A strategy that works exactly as well for banking dynasties as it does for the rest of us. On May 11, 1931, the Kreditanstalt announced that it could not publish its regular financial statements because doing so would reveal losses so catastrophic they would trigger immediate panic. Which of course was exactly what happened anyway. The announcement that you can't tell people how much money you've lost is generally interpreted as confirmation that you've lost a lot of money. Depositors rushed to withdraw their savings. International creditors demanded immediate repayment. The Austrian government scrambled to organize a rescue package. Within days, the crisis had spread beyond Austria's borders, triggering bank runs in Germany, Hungary, and across Central Europe. The Kreditanstalt collapse is now recognized by economic historians as one of the pivotal moments of the Great Depression, the point at which a serious economic downturn became a civilization-threatening catastrophe. The banking panic it triggered led directly to Germany's banking crisis of 1931, which in turn contributed to political instability that helped bring the Nazis to power. It's not an exaggeration to say that the failure of this one bank in a relatively small country changed the course of world history. International finance, it turns out, is a lot like a game of Jenga. Remove one piece and the whole structure can come tumbling down. For the Rothschilds specifically, the Kreditanstalt disaster was a major blow, but not a fatal one. The Vienna branch lost heavily, and the family's Austrian operations never fully recovered. The prestige of being associated with such a spectacular failure was damaging, and predictably, anti-Semites seized on the collapse as proof of their conspiracy theories. Nazi propagandists had a field day, pointing to the Jewish bank that had supposedly drained Austria's wealth before conveniently going bust. Never mind that the bank's problems were the result of macroeconomic forces affecting all of Europe, or that the Austrian government had actively encouraged the mergers that created the bloated institution. When you're looking for scapegoats, facts are merely inconvenient details to be ignored. But here's the crucial point. The Rothschilds survived. Not just individually, the family as a whole emerged from the Depression era battered but intact, still wealthy, still influential, still in business. How? The answer lies in a principle that Meyer Amschel had instilled in his sons over a century earlier. Never put all your eggs in one basket, even if it's a very nice basket with excellent returns. By 1931, the Rothschild fortune was no longer concentrated in any single institution, country, or even industry. The 5 branches, London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples, had evolved into semi-independent operations with their own portfolios and risk profiles. When Vienna stumbled, London didn't automatically fall with it. The family had investments in railroads across multiple continents, mining operations in Africa and the Americas, real estate in dozens of cities, art collections worth fortunes on their own, and financial instruments spread across every major economy. They owned vineyards in France, estates in England, and industrial concerns in Germany. No single failure, no matter how large, could wipe them out. This wasn't just luck or coincidence, it was deliberate strategy, refined over generations. The Rothschilds had learned from watching other banking dynasties rise and fall that concentration was dangerous. The Baring family, once rivals to the Rothschilds in British finance, had nearly collapsed in 1890 due to overexposure to Argentine debt. Other great banking houses had been destroyed by wars, revolutions, or simply bad bets on the wrong industries. The Rothschilds avoided these fates by maintaining what modern financial advisors would call a diversified portfolio. Except they were doing it on a scale that made modern diversification look timid. Consider what the family's holdings looked like in the 1930s. The London branch, under the leadership of Lionel Nathan de Rothschild, remained one of the most respected names in British finance, managing investments for individuals, institutions, and governments. The Paris branch, headed by Edouard de Rothschild, controlled significant industrial and financial assets in France and its colonies. The family still held substantial stakes in mining companies, including the now controversial De Beers. They owned some of the finest vineyards in Bordeaux, Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Chateau Mouton Rothschild, producing wines that wealthy collectors would later pay tens of thousands of dollars per bottle to acquire. They had art collections that included old masters, impressionists, and decorative arts worth more than the GDP of small countries. And crucially, much of this wealth existed in forms that couldn't simply evaporate in a banking crisis. Land doesn't disappear when stock markets crash. Vineyards keep producing grapes regardless of what's happening on Wall Street. Paintings by Vermeer and Rembrandt don't become worthless because depositors are panicking in Vienna. The Rothschilds had converted a significant portion of their paper wealth into tangible assets that retained value even when financial systems were in chaos. It was old money thinking in the best sense. The understanding that real wealth is measured not just in account balances, but in things that exist in the physical world. The Depression years were hardly pleasant for the family, of course. Asset values declined across the board. Some investments lost money. The political environment grew increasingly threatening, especially on the continent, where fascist movements were gaining power partly by scapegoating wealthy Jews. The Vienna branch, wounded by Kreditanstalt, would never regain its former prominence. But the family's overall position remained secure enough that when the real catastrophe came, Nazi persecution and World War II, most Rothschilds had the resources to escape, relocate, and eventually rebuild. There's a lesson here that extends beyond the Rothschilds themselves. Economic crises punish concentration and reward diversification. The depositors who lost everything when Kreditanstalt collapsed had put their trust in a single institution. The investors who bet everything on stocks in 1929 watched their life savings evaporate. The families who had invested across different asset classes, geographies, and industries, like the Rothschilds, weathered the storm. This isn't to minimize the suffering of those who lost everything. Most people don't have the luxury of diversifying their wealth across multiple continents. But for those who do have resources, the Rothschild approach offers a template for financial survival. The Kreditanstalt collapse also illustrates something important about the relationship between wealth and resilience. True financial security doesn't come from having one really successful investment. It comes from being able to survive when your most successful investment fails. The Rothschilds could afford to lose Kreditanstalt because they had so much else. They could afford to lose their Austrian real estate when the Nazis confiscated it because they had British and French real estate. They could afford to lose access to German markets because they still had American and colonial markets. Redundancy, in finance as in engineering, is what prevents single points of failure from becoming total system failures. The family's response to the crisis also demonstrated their characteristic adaptability. As traditional banking became more regulated and less profitable in the Depression era, the Rothschilds shifted their focus. They invested more heavily in industrial concerns, real estate, and what we would now call private equity. They became less visible in day-to-day financial markets, but maintained their influence through quieter channels. The flamboyant days of Nathan Rothschild dominating the London Stock Exchange were over. The new Rothschild style was lower profile, more diversified, and less dependent on any single revenue stream. By the time World War II ended, the Rothschild empire looked very different from its 19th century peak. The Vienna and Frankfurt branches were effectively destroyed, their assets seized, their operations shuttered, their family members scattered. The Naples branch had faded into insignificance decades earlier. But London and Paris remained, diminished but viable, and the family's collective wealth, though reduced, was still substantial. The Rothschilds had survived the worst economic crisis in modern history and the worst persecution Jews had ever faced. They were not what they had been, but they were still there, still wealthy, and still planning for the future. The Kreditanstalt collapse was a turning point, marking the end of an era when the Rothschilds could be considered dominant forces in European finance. After 1931, they were important players, but no longer the undisputed titans of their grandfather's generation. Other forces, American banks, government financial institutions, the growing power of central banks, had displaced the private banking dynasties that had once ruled finance. But while other dynasties faded entirely, the Rothschilds endured. And in the strange mathematics of multi-generational wealth preservation, endurance counts for more than dominance. The families that survived the 20th century, with all its wars, revolutions, and economic catastrophes, are the ones still here today. The Rothschilds are among them, which is no small achievement given everything that tried to destroy them. The Kreditanstalt collapse and the Great Depression had wounded the Rothschilds. But what came next was an existential threat, not just to their wealth or influence, but to their very survival as human beings. We've already touched on Nazi anti-Semitism and the propaganda that targeted the family. But now we need to talk about what happened when that hatred became government policy, backed by tanks, soldiers, and an industrialized machinery of death. March 1938. German troops rolled into Austria in what would become known as the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich. For most Austrians, this was a moment of either terror or enthusiastic welcome, depending on their politics. For the Rothschilds of Vienna, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Within days of the Nazi takeover, Louis Nathaniel von Rothschild, the head of the Austrian branch, great-great-grandson of the founder Meyer Amschel, was arrested by the Gestapo. The Nazis weren't subtle about what they wanted. Everything. The family's Austrian properties, their art collections, their business interests, their bank accounts, all of it was to be surrendered to the Reich. Louis spent over a year in Nazi custody. Not in a concentration camp. The Nazis understood he was worth more as a bargaining chip than as a corpse, but under house arrest and constant surveillance while negotiations dragged on. The ransom eventually demanded was staggering: the complete surrender of all Rothschild properties in Austria, including the family's steel mills, their share of the Kreditanstalt, their estates, and art collections that included works by Vermeer, Franz Hals, and Gainsborough. The Nazis got what they wanted: property worth tens of millions of 1930s dollars, equivalent to billions today, and Louis was finally released in 1939, leaving Austria with essentially nothing but his life. Other family members scattered across Europe faced their own desperate choices. The Paris Rothschilds watched the German army approach in 1940 with growing alarm. When France fell, many fled south, eventually making their way to the United States, Britain, or neutral countries. Edouard de Rothschild, head of the French branch, escaped to New York, while his cousins found refuge wherever they could. The family's French properties, including the legendary Chateau Lafite vineyard, were seized by the Nazis and used as headquarters for German officers. Imagine German military commanders drinking wine from cellars they'd stolen from Jewish bankers they'd forced into exile. The irony was apparently lost on them. The Rothschilds who made it to Britain were relatively fortunate. The English branch had never been disrupted, and Britain itself wasn't occupied. But even there, the family contributed to the war effort and waited anxiously for news of relatives trapped on the continent. Some family members who couldn't or wouldn't flee faced grimmer fates. While the main branches of the family largely survived thanks to their resources and connections, extended relatives and family employees were not always so lucky. The Holocaust consumed 6 million Jewish lives. The Rothschilds, despite their wealth, could not shield everyone connected to them from that catastrophe. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Rothschilds faced a transformed world. The old European order that had created and sustained their rise was gone, replaced by a bipolar system dominated by the United States and Soviet Union. And here was the problem for a family that had built its empire on European finance. The center of global capitalism had decisively shifted across the Atlantic. The United States, which emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic power, was territory where the Rothschilds had never established a major presence. They had connections, investments, and relationships in America, but nothing like the commanding position they'd held in London, Paris, and Vienna during the 19th century. This wasn't an accident or oversight. The Rothschilds had actually considered establishing an American branch in the 19th century, but decided against it. The United States was too far from Europe, too chaotic politically, and too full of aggressive local competitors who wouldn't defer to European banking aristocracy. American finance developed its own dynasties: the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Mellons, who had no particular reason to make room for foreign competition. By the time the Rothschilds recognized that America was becoming the center of global finance, it was too late to establish the kind of dominant position they'd once held in Europe. The post-war decades brought recovery, but also continued challenges. The family reclaimed some of what had been stolen, though battles over Nazi-looted art would continue for decades, with some pieces still disputed today. The French Rothschilds returned to Paris and rebuilt their banking operations, eventually regaining their vineyards and much of their former status. The British branch remained solid, if no longer spectacular by 19th century standards. But the world had changed in ways that made the old Rothschild model obsolete. Banking itself was different now. Governments had become far more involved in financial regulation and monetary policy. Central banks, rather than private bankers, controlled currency and credit. The intimate relationships between private banking houses and government treasuries that had made the Rothschilds powerful were being replaced by more bureaucratic, institutionalized systems. A family bank, no matter how wealthy or well-connected, couldn't compete with the scale of post-war American investment banks or the resources of government-backed financial institutions. And then came 1981, and what must have felt like a particularly French insult. François Mitterrand, a socialist, won the French presidency and promptly nationalized the country's major banks, including Banque Rothschild. The family that had financed French governments for nearly 2 centuries watched as their bank was absorbed into the state apparatus. It was, in some ways, a fitting irony. The Rothschilds had always operated at the intersection of private wealth and public power. And now, the public power had simply taken what it wanted. David de Rothschild, who had been running the French bank, found himself suddenly unemployed, at least in the banking sector. But here's where the Rothschild talent for adaptation showed itself once again. Nationalization didn't mean extinction. It meant pivoting. The family shifted their focus away from traditional banking toward areas where their advantages remained intact. Asset management, where relationships and reputation mattered more than scale. Wine, where the Rothschild name was literally on the bottle. Real estate, where their existing holdings generated steady income regardless of what politicians did. Private investments in industries ranging from mining to media to luxury goods. When French banking was re-privatized in the 1980s and 1990s, the Rothschilds were ready to return. David de Rothschild founded a new bank, eventually merging it with the British branch to create Rothschild & Co., which today operates as a global financial advisory firm. It's not the dominant force that Nathan Rothschild's operation was in the 19th century, but it's a legitimate player in mergers and acquisitions, wealth management, and corporate finance. The family had learned that flexibility matters more than pride, that surviving as a smaller, more focused operation is better than being destroyed trying to maintain an outdated model. The 20th century had thrown everything at the Rothschilds: world wars, genocide, economic collapse, political revolution, nationalization. Other banking dynasties from the 19th century simply disappeared, victims of one or another of these catastrophes. The Rothschilds endured, not unchanged, not undiminished, but present. Still wealthy, still influential, still in the game. That persistence, across decades of turmoil that would have destroyed less adaptable families, is perhaps the most remarkable part of the Rothschild story. So here we are, at the end of our journey through 2.5 centuries of Rothschild history. And you might be wondering, where are they now? If you search the Forbes billionaire list, you won't find a single Rothschild, not one. In a world obsessed with ranking wealth, tracking private jets, and documenting the spending habits of the ultra-rich, the family that once financed nations has essentially disappeared from public view. Is this because they lost their fortune? Did the 20th century finally break them? Not exactly. The truth is more interesting and more characteristically Rothschild than simple decline. The family made a conscious decision, probably the smartest one they've made since Meyer Amschel told his sons to stick together, to stop being visible. Visibility they had learned through bitter experience brought conspiracy theories, anti-Semitic attacks, political targeting, and the kind of attention that makes it harder to do business. The 19th century Rothschilds had been celebrities, their comings and goings reported in newspapers, their wealth a matter of public fascination. The 20th and 21st century Rothschilds chose a different path. Be wealthy, but be quiet about it. The Forbes list, it turns out, only captures a certain kind of wealth, the kind that's concentrated in single individuals running publicly traded companies or private businesses with known valuations. Elon Musk shows up because we know roughly what Tesla is worth and how many shares he owns. Jeff Bezos appears because Amazon's stock price is public information. But what about wealth that's been distributed across dozens of family members, held in trusts that don't disclose their assets, invested in private companies that don't publish their finances, and spread across so many different entities that no single person can be said to own it? That wealth becomes effectively invisible, not hidden illegally, just structured in ways that don't fit into Forbes' methodology. This is exactly what the Rothschilds have done. Over generations, the family fortune has been divided among hundreds of descendants, each inheriting a piece of the whole. There are Rothschilds in banking, Rothschilds in winemaking, Rothschilds in art collection, Rothschilds in environmental conservation, and Rothschilds who have nothing to do with finance at all. Some are wealthy by any standard. Others are merely comfortable. The unified empire of the five brothers has become a loose confederation of related individuals, connected by blood and history, but operating independently. But don't mistake distribution for dissipation. The total Rothschild wealth, if you could somehow add it all up, which you probably can't, remains enormous. Consider just the visible pieces. The wine business alone is worth billions of euros. Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Chateau Mouton Rothschild produce some of the world's most expensive wines, with rare vintages selling for tens of thousands of dollars per bottle. The family still holds significant stakes in mining operations, including historical connections to companies like Rio Tinto. They have real estate across Europe worth hundreds of millions. They have art collections that museums would kill for, literally some of the finest private collections in existence. And then there's Rothschild and Company, the family's financial services firm. It's not JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs. It's not even trying to be. Instead, it's a boutique operation specializing in advisory services for mergers, acquisitions, and debt restructuring. When major companies are buying or selling each other, when governments are restructuring their debts, when wealthy families need discreet financial advice, Rothschild and Company is often in the room. The firm manages assets and provides counsel to clients who value discretion over flashiness, which, if you think about it, is a perfect business for a family that has learned the dangers of being too visible. The family's influence today operates through channels that don't make headlines. A Rothschild sits on this corporate board. Another advises that government ministry. A third funds environmental research. A fourth collects contemporary art. They're not pulling strings from shadowy boardrooms, contrary to what the conspiracy theorists imagine, but they're present in elite circles across multiple continents, participating in decisions that shape economies and culture. It's not the concentrated power of Nathan Rothschild at Waterloo. It's a diffuse, distributed influence that's harder to see but still meaningful. Perhaps the most important legacy is simply the example the Rothschilds provide, both positive and negative, of how wealth operates across generations. They showed that family unity can be a competitive advantage, that information is more valuable than gold, that diversification protects against catastrophe, and that adaptability matters more than pride. They also showed how wealth becomes entangled with systems of exploitation, how success breeds resentment, and how even the richest family in the world can't buy safety from persecution. For those who came to this video hoping for confirmation that the Rothschilds secretly control everything, I'm sorry to disappoint. They don't. They're a wealthy, influential family with a remarkable history. But they're not puppet masters manipulating world events from behind the curtain. The world is too complex, too chaotic, and too full of competing interests for any single family, no matter how rich, to control. What the Rothschilds actually demonstrate is something both more mundane and more interesting. That patient, strategic accumulation of wealth across generations can create an enduring legacy that survives catastrophes, adapts to changing circumstances, and maintains influence long after the original fortune builders are gone. Their story isn't really about secret power. It's about visible wealth that learned to become invisible, concentrated power that learned to become distributed, and a family that has spent 2 centuries navigating the space between triumph and tragedy. From the cramped lanes of the Frankfurt ghetto to the boardrooms of global finance, from carrier pigeons to modern telecommunications, from financing Napoleon's enemies to advising 21st century corporations, the Rothschilds have remained constant in only one thing: their determination to survive and adapt, whatever history throws at them. So the next time someone tells you that the Rothschilds secretly run the world, you'll know the real story is both less dramatic and more fascinating. They don't run the world, but they've been watching it, influencing it, and profiting from it for longer than most nations have existed. And if history is any guide, they'll still be doing it long after we're all gone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most legendary families, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what other dynasties should we explore next? Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the most interesting truths are usually more complicated than the conspiracy theories.